In it here now, what are you gonna do now? I'm gonna been on here now, who bid $500,000 bid.
Welcome to the Legacy of Agriculture. This program will explore the past, present, and future of agriculture. We'll look at the people, products, and events that have formed its history. And now, with today's guest, your host, Chris Bear.
Hey, good morning, everybody. This is Chris Bear, your host of the Legacy of Agriculture. Thank you for joining us on this Saturday morning. It's a beautiful day in South Dakota. Today, I'd like to thank our sponsor, Pfeiffer Auction and Realty, for making this show possible. And today we're broadcasting remotely. I'm in my office just south of Sioux Falls, South Dakota. And my good long-term friend, Tim Janecek from Harsh International, is joining us from Eastern Colorado. Good morning, Tim.
Good morning, Chris.
I appreciate you taking time on a busy Saturday morning to join us on the Legacy of Agriculture. You know, as I've known you over the years, I've been very impressed with Harsh as a company manufacturing mixers, but not only getting it started in the hoist division many years ago. And in the next segment, we're going to get into that quite a bit more. But I want to talk about you, Tim. Our show is about history, and we're both getting old enough. There's just a little bit of history with us. You were a Nebraska ranch kid.
Yes, I was.
Tell me a little bit about your start and how you got into agriculture and why you're in agriculture.
Well, I was born into agriculture, obviously, and I grew up about 45 miles northwest of North Platte, Nebraska, up in the Sandhills. God's cow country in my terms. But you know, as a very young man, my father passed away, so I had an uncle that was partners somewhat with my dad that kind of took us under his wing, and you know, he was just a good old boy, an old cowboy, professional bulldogger, and the guy started with nothing, and you know, ended up with some pockets full of money, and just the kind of guy you have to admire. You know, nothing was ever handed to him, so that was kind of the way I was brought up. You know, we had started out a cow calf operation, and because of labor, and I'm sure it had a lot to do with the absence of my dad in the operation, he turned it over to a yearling operation. And so I got to learn, you know, a little bit about both aspects of that, and, you know, the labor that goes into raising cattle. You know, it's a good way to grow up and a good place to grow up.
You know, and in getting to know you over the years, Tim, you spent a lot of time on the back of a horse and
Yes,
and riding horses and checking cattle, but also a lot of experience with work horses and draft horses.
Yes, I did. You know, of course, growing up in the 60s and 70s and in the Sandhills, a lot of draft horses were still being used, and so I got some early experience doing that. You know, really loved it. Of course, what boy doesn't love a horse, any kind of a horse? But after I got out of college, I had the opportunity to go work for a really close friend of my uncle that raised me. His name was Howard Haythorne, and they used horses for everything there. So I still have a picture on my wall up here, which I believe was in probably the early 80s. So I want to say 82, 83. We were still feeding cows with horses every day and stacking hay all summer with a team of horses. So yeah, I've had a set of lines in my hands as much as I've had a rope in my hands. You know, it's cool upbringing.
Do you miss it?
Oh yeah, I miss it until it got like 2 weeks ago when it's 25 below. Then you know this office seems pretty nice then.
That's the heater on a pickup's a lot better than standing behind a team of horses at 20 below zero and about a 35-mile-an-hour wind. Is that right?
Yeah, you know, and there were ways to get warm when you were doing that, but they weren't as easy as sitting in behind the steering wheel of the pickup. That's for sure.
It's really spoiled us now. We even have heaters on the steering wheel of our pickups.
Right. That's a good point. I remember in the early days, my old uncle, he would buy his Ford pickups with no radio, no heater.
Wow. You can't get that today, that's for sure.
No.
What's one of your favorite memories of being on a horse or running a team of horses?
You know, as far as running a team of horses, I would have to say that dates back early, and I was probably, you know, I want to say maybe even before I was 10 years old, just the connection between the the guy driving the team and the team of horses cabling a stack of hay onto a hay sled, and my uncle never touching the lines, just talking to the horses. And if he needed the stack of hay to go another foot, they easily did that and stopped without pulling it over. And I kind of modeled my life to what I saw in him. And then when I got to where I was using draft horses, I always used that for a goal to be as good as him. And I think that's one of the goals that I followed for many, many years. But as far as the horses, yeah, I my favorite time was cabling hay and feeding hay to cows in the wintertime. It didn't matter if it was 20 below or a nice 40-degree spring morning. It was just fun.
When I was a kid, Tim, I was blessed enough on our farm back home is we had horses. But when I remember being really little as a kid and being scared to death of horses. And it really wasn't until I was probably 10, 11, 12 years old or 13 years old that I got over that fear of horses. And part of that fear is when I was little, we had a little Shetland pony. He was the meanest, orneriest little bugger on the whole face of this earth. His name was Pokey, actually. And that horse ran away with me so many times. It made me scared of the big horses. Were you ever scared of horses?
Yeah, when I was little, I was scared of them. And I remember the conversation I had with my uncle to get myself over that, because he sent me one morning out to the backside of the pasture by myself. We were gathering 2-year-old steers. I didn't want to go by myself. And it was still dark. And he just said, he goes, there's nothing to be scared of. He said that horse is going to do everything you ask him to do, and there's no reason you can't just go do whatever it is you want to do. He said, don't ever worry about what could go wrong. Worry about what you're going to do next. He said, just put your focus in line. And it was like in one morning I kind of got over that, and I realized that, yeah, there was no reason to be scared of that horse. He was my friend, and that horse and I became pretty good buddies over the years.
He became your working partner.
He did. I took care of him and he took care of me.
How do you think that being raised on a ranch in northwestern Nebraska helped you develop core values and values?
Well, I think a lot of that stems from, of course, the values were there to begin with. I'm going to give the old boy credit for that. And the other thing is, at least the way we operated, we were a small family on a fair-sized ranch, and you had to depend on yourself or someone else. So you had to be honest with all the information that was passed back and forth. I learned that at an early age. The better you could portray what was going on or what you needed help with, the better it always was. And it goes back to that little story. And I remember him telling me, if you tell a lie, the thing about that is you got to remember what you said. If you tell the truth, that memory is always etched in your skull. And there's so much truth to that, but I found it to be, the more honest you could be with somebody, no matter what the situation is, the more helpful they could be to you. And that's good learning, and it's something you take to the grave.
It seems like you're exactly right. When you always tell the truth, you never have to remember what the lie was, and that's a great place to be. And that seems to be a fairly common thing amongst kids that grow up in agriculture and kids that are learning out on the farms and ranches, is they learn how to be honest. And I know that my dad was that way. Well, Tim, hey, we're coming down to the end of our first segment here on the Legacy of Agriculture. Tim Janecek, the Harsh International Sales Manager, is joining us here this morning. We appreciate Tim for joining us. We appreciate our sponsor, Pfeiffer Auction and Realty, and for complete listing of all of the auctions that we've got coming in the spring of 2024, visit our website at pfeifers.com or give us a call, 605-836-2277. Nobody does it better.
This is Kyle, Equipment Sales Representative with Pfeiffer's Auction and Realty. Pfeiffer's is proud to provide the best seller experience around. From start to finish, our trained equipment representatives will make sure the right decisions are made to get the most money from your new or used equipment. We believe that knowledge is power, and our reps provide you with the current market estimates to help better understand machinery values. If you want to sell machinery, then nobody does it better.
Good morning, folks. This is Chris Bear, your host of the Legacy of Agriculture. I appreciate you joining me on this Saturday morning. Got my good friend Tim Janecek from Harsh Manufacturing out of Colorado is joining me this morning. We had a great first segment talking about being raised in the sand hills of Nebraska. And Tim, that's an experience that a lot of kids don't get.
It sure is. It sure
And
is. It's an experience I'm glad I had.
talking a little bit about horses and I'm kind of excited and I'm going to give a precursor to a show that we've got coming up. Last November, I was over in Wisconsin and did a farm sale in western Wisconsin, and the farm that we actually did, I should say ranch at, probably would be the proper term, was actually a farm where they raised horses, Clydesdale work horses for Budweiser. And we're going to be doing that show in the weeks to come. So I'm kind of excited to produce that show. That'll be a great show. But anyways, you're the international sales manager for Harsh, and Harsh has been around for a lot of years. And Tim, part of the reason we're doing this show is simply that it seems like time is closing its eyes on history, and we're starting to lose the incredible amount of hard work that the generations before us put in, and the hard work in their lives, so that we can enjoy what we have today. And I know that many times you and I have talked about Harsh and its inception. And when you think about Harsh, you think about mixers. Harsh manufactures and ships mixers all over the world. But that's not where Harsh got its start. Harsh got its start from building hoists. And tell us a little bit about Harsh's inception and how many years ago that was, and tell us that story.
Okay, well, Harsh was officially established in 1948. And prior to that, it was somewhat of a blacksmith slash fabrication shop. You know, that Bud Harsh, the original owner of Harsh, his dad, I believe, had a blacksmith shop, and he just kind of grew up in that. But when Bud got started in the business, right here in Colorado was big beet country, and the old side dump beet trucks, and a lot of those back then were even horse-drawn wagons, but they didn't have any mechanized way of dumping. They were side dumps, and they had to trip them.
Yep.
And so you can imagine they were man killers.
Yeah,
But
absolutely.
anyhow, Bud,
That's why so many people got hurt putting
yes,
up, especially grass hay, is because it was dangerous. It was not safe.
and so Bud decided there had to be a better way of doing that, a safer way of doing that. So he developed a hydraulic cylinder mechanism for the side dump beet trucks. That way they could easily be side dumped and put back without anybody smashing their fingers or getting a face full of the side gate or whatever it was. And that grew to, well, the better way he thought to do that was to dump them from the end and not from the side. He thought that was more efficient. It was, but it presented a problem of tipping. If they weren't on even ground, and they raise that bed clear up under load, it's going to tip over and bend things. So he devised what's called, and what we still use today, the scissor assembly for the hoist. And that was just a means of stabilizing it from side to side. And it was an awesome invention. Bud got drafted into World War II, and through the Corps of Engineers, he was very instrumental in inventing underground cutting and welding, which was obviously to get sailors out of sunken ships. And in doing that, he got into was involved in an explosion that ruined his eardrums. Now he could still hear, but it ruined his equilibrium. So he came back from the war to Harsh and was in a wheelchair and put his mind to work. And I'm told stories of Bud Harsh sitting back in the shop, which is part of the building we still sit in today, sitting in his wheelchair with soapstones taped together, drawing actual drawings out on the floor. And it's
Really?
too bad we don't have a glass covered piece of that, because it'd just be a really, really neat piece of history. But the guy had a great mind to start with, and then when everything else was taken away from his body but his mind, he capitalized on that, and he became very, very successful at it. Cattle feeding was just starting to boom in the late 40s in this area. And, he had some pretty good buddies. One of them was W.D. Farr, who was, a big cattle feeder, one of the first cattle feeders in the area, and also very instrumental in designing the irrigation water system in the state of Colorado. And another good friend of Bud Harsh's was Warren Monford. He was the patriarch of the Monford family, Monford of Colorado. And they had built huge feedlots around here, and they came to Bud and they said, "Can you make us some better way of mixing feed cattle?" And he did it. And of course, that's how the mixer division side of it was born.
When was the first harsh mixtures manufactured or designed and tested, Tim?
So that's a little bit fuzzy because there wasn't a whole lot of documentation of the R&D and things like that. But I'm going to say it was in the mid to late 40s when they really got serious about, getting stuff done, and, built the first 4-auger mixer. And I think they played around a little bit with some chain floor, Kelly Ryan type stuff just to deliver feed. But they decided the easier, more efficient way to do it was to put it in, mix it, and then go unload it. And that's how the 4-auger design came to fruit. It's a design we're still building today.
So I want to go back. Something that you said that was really interesting, Tim, about Bud Harsh is that when he was in the war, World War II, he helped design underwater a cutting system. Is that right? To get sailors out of ships.
Yeah, cutting and welding.
So how did that work? That I did not know that. So tell me about that.
I'm not real familiar with the whole process of it. A lot of it had to do with the grounding mechanisms and things like that. But they had to have higher pressure on there because I'm assuming back then there were only acetylene torches, and to make that work underwater, you had to have a way to get it going. And I'm assuming that your gas pressures had to be a little bit higher and things like that. And as far as the welding part of it, I'm sure they had to have a specialized welding rod that the flux didn't get soaked up in the water. And of course, you got to imagine it was salt water too. So that probably had its own set of challenges as well. But I wish I knew more about that part of the equation. But I know Bud was right there on the leading edge of that.
Well, what's really interesting to me, now I'm going to fast forward just a little bit from that. I did not know that, and that's very, very interesting. I'm very pleased to know that. But when he came back from the war and started the hoist division, or started building the hoist, the scissor hoist, a lot of people don't understand that not only did they put hoists on trucks, but they put it on wagons as well.
Mm-hmm.
And every once in a while, we'll have a single direction, or a one-way ram is probably the proper term for it, that they would put it on wagons too. And so the wagons that were going into the elevators or going to the farmyard out of the field had a one-way hoist. And so if you had any type of hydraulic pump, you could dump a wagon as well. Is that right?
That's exactly right. And they called it there's a single acting cylinder and a double acting cylinder. And one of Bud's early patents was a multi-stage cylinder. So it would have larger stages going down to smaller stages. So as you put the oil to the cylinder and expanded it, the larger stage would go out first and stop, and then the next size stage, and then the next, and so on. And to retract that cylinder on the hoist, you just let the oil go back to the reservoir. So that
Right.
worked very, very well on a tractor because you didn't have to pump it down. You just let the oil flow down, to lower the bed. And those were very popular with farmers. The old trucks back in those days were pretty limited in what their capabilities were. And it was a lot easier to hook an M Farm All or, an A John Deere, something like that, to a tractor and go out and retrieve crops from the field, especially if they were a little bit muddy. So that hoist system allowed them to hook that to really any kind of a tractor that had, the lowest volume hydraulic pump that was available in the day, which, they didn't have much back then.
Yeah, that's right. Hey, Tim, we're coming to the end of our second segment here on the legacy of agriculture. We appreciate our sponsor, Pifer Auction and Realty. For a complete list of all the auctions that we got this spring, go to pifers.com or give us a call at 605 836 2277. Nobody does it better.
This is Jasmine with Pifer's Auction and Realty. We have a great lineup of machinery and farm sales this spring. Many of them already have listings available on our website. If you're looking to buy land or machinery, go to www.pifers.com to see a complete catalog of our auctions. It's updated daily, so make sure to check back in with us and find the perfect lot for you. When it comes to auctions, nobody does it better.
Good morning, everybody. This is your host, Chris Bear, with the Legacy of Agriculture, and my good friend Tim Janecek from Harsh Manufacturing in Eastern Colorado is joining me here this morning. Tim, thank you. We've had a good couple of segments. In the second segment, we talked about Harsh's founder, Bud Harsh, who during World War II helped develop a way to help the soldiers in the Marines, developed a way to be able to cut into sunken submarines to get soldiers out and to get people out of those submarines. That was very interesting to me, Tim, and I appreciate you sharing that with us. But in this, and then we talked about Bud developing and inventing the Harsh scissor lift hoist, the single ram hoist, the scissor lift hoist, and eventually into the mixer business. As I have studied really quite diligently, Tim, agriculture and studied a lot of reports, it's staggering to me to know, and I'm going to read some statistics here of the top 10 states with the most land in production, agricultural land in farms. And this comes from the USDA. Texas has over 126 million acres, which constitutes 14%. I'm going to skip down to your hometown of Nebraska, which is number 4 in the nation with almost 45 million acres. Here in South Dakota, we've got over 43 million acres of land in farms. And then on down to Colorado, which is almost 32 million acres. We know that God isn't making any more farmland, right?
No, he sure is.
But we do know that agriculture is becoming much more efficient and much more productive, and we're producing a lot more commodities on the same amount of land that we've had all along. And one of the things that's interesting, and you and I have had a lot of healthy discussion, is where's the direction? What direction do you see from a manufacturer standpoint that we are moving in agriculture, especially in the Midwest?
Well, for the last 25 years or so, I've been, more involved in the feedlot industry side of it. So, I'll kind of base my conversation on that because that's the depth of my knowledge. But I've seen a lot more concentration over the years. The big corporations coming in, whether they're foreign owned or whether they're domestically owned. But it just seemed like the big guy kept getting bigger. And I think in row crop farming and ranching, that's true as well. It just seems like, somebody will come in and buy up the neighbor's ground and then that just doesn't stop. The feedlot industry is much the same. And we saw feedlots from the 70s, go from, say, let's just say a 25,000 head feed yard that was owned by, a family or 2 or 3 partners to huge corporations that own maybe a dozen 50,000 head feed yards or 100,000 head feed yards. And as we saw that grow like that, it made it harder for the littler guy to compete with them. They didn't have the buying power, they didn't have the marketing power. And let's fast forward to today. In the last 4 or 5 years, we've seen what our problem was all along, rear its ugly head even more, is the labor situation. We've got less people that want to do that work. And what I find interesting is you take a large concentrated feedlot. Let's just compare 110,000 head feed yard to a 10,000 head feed yard. It takes much more labor. There's a lot more going on. It's a lot more intense in a larger yard. And yes, they've got the buying power and the selling power, so they kind of push the little guy out. But the little guy doesn't need as much help.
Right.
He's a little more self-sustaining. And I've seen this parallel coming together, and it's kind of an interesting way to look at it. The larger guy's also not as efficient as a smaller guy because it does take more help, and there's more inexperienced help out there. Or the little guy, maybe it's just him and his son, or him and his brother, or possibly him by himself, and they control their situation a little easier. I think far easier than the larger guy does, because he doesn't have as much to deal with, and he doesn't have to go out and try to do a 20-man job with 12.
Right.
And other than a death in the family or something like that, and yeah, I get it, kids go to college and they didn't want to come back to agriculture, so their labor force shrunk too, but they didn't try to take on more with what they had. They just worked with the hand they were dealt with. And I see that guy kind of coming back into play, because he doesn't have some of those extreme circumstances, especially on the labor side of it.
Right.
He doesn't have the millions of dollars of income to deal with that the larger yards do per week or per month, but he also doesn't have their expenses either, or their problems. So I think that's kind of interesting to see how that's playing out right now. It seems to me like the little guys are they're hanging in there. They haven't went away. Some of them, yes, have went away, but some of the big ones went away as well. But
Right.
I see the little guy gaining traction right now. And I'm not going to say he's taken over, and I'm not going to make a prediction on that, or it's just an opinion, but it's just kind of the way I see it. It's kind of interesting. We see the problems with our equipment out there in some of the larger yards, and it's because they have more of it. It's not that they have more problems with any kind of equipment, but they just have more equipment there, so their problems are larger. Or the little guy, on the other side of the coin, maybe he only has one payload or one feed truck, and yeah, it's maybe a bigger problem when he has a problem, but it doesn't happen as often because he doesn't have the numbers on.
And sometimes that's an easier problem to solve than the big guy that's running a big major operation. Would you agree?
Yeah, absolutely.
Are you making any adjustments in your manufacturing to accommodate maybe the smaller operator at all?
We have never walked away from the smaller operation, and I believe that's one thing that sets Harsh, under the Brown family's guidance, apart from anybody else in the industry. We never set our sights on the big corporate customer only. We never looked away from the little guy. We do just as much stuff for the little guy as we do the big guy. We can do it both, and that's another thing I truly believe that sets us apart. We don't have to concentrate our efforts on one thing to make this place work. To grease our wheels, we've left the same wheels on the ground. We've replaced the tires a few times, but we really haven't changed our direction or our focus of doing business and geared it towards one segment versus the other.
Right.
Some people could call that old fashioned, but we've been here for 75 years. We're the oldest mixer company in this nation.
Yep. Hey, folks, we're coming down to the end of our third segment. My good friend and Tim Janecek has joined us this Saturday morning, and we're going to be right back in just a few minutes. We're going to take a commercial break at the Legacy of Agriculture. I'm your host, Chris Bear. We'll be right back.
This is Kyle, equipment sales representative with Pfeiffer's Auction and Realty. Pfeiffer's is proud to provide the best seller experience around. From start to finish, our trained equipment representatives will make sure the right decisions are made to get the most money from your new or used equipment. We believe that knowledge is power, and our reps provide you with the current market estimates to help better understand machinery values. If you want to sell machinery, then nobody does it better.
Good morning, everybody. This is Chris Bear, your host of the Legacy of Agriculture. Tim Janecek from Harsh Manufacturing is joining us. We appreciate you, Tim, for taking time out of your busy schedule. And we've had a good first three segments talking about Tim's being raised in the panhandle of Nebraska and his life in the manufacturing business and in agriculture. Tim, I have such a soft spot in my heart for agriculture. I absolutely love agriculture. I think it's the greatest profession on the face of this earth. It's a profession, and it doesn't matter if you're the seed salesman, the equipment manufacturer, the auctioneer, the dealer, whatever that is, it always seems like it's a giving occupation, regardless of where you are in agriculture. Would you agree with that?
Oh, I would agree 100%.
And I know that you were raised the right way. You were raised on a ranch, and I was raised on a farm out west. And one of the things that I'm really concerned about is some statistics that we have talked about a lot on the legacy of agriculture is that 150 years ago, it took 85 to 90% of the population in the United States to feed this nation. And now we're under 2% of the population that's feeding this nation. And I honestly, Tim, I don't know if that's a good thing or a bad thing. I think in a way it's a good thing because we can do so much more with less. But one of my concerns is as I've watched my children grow, and the majority of my children now are in their 20s. I've got one son that's 16 years old. They don't know a lot about agriculture, and I think about the young man you were being raised on the ranch. There was a transition from production agriculture to manufacturing. I know you stepped away from it for a few years after you were married, um, and I made that transition from the farm when I was in college into the machinery side and into the auction industry. But how do we keep these kids engaged from a manufacturer standpoint, Tim? What can we do to help these kids, these teenage kids that maybe were or were not even raised on a farm, come into agriculture and stay in agriculture?
Well, I think the first thing, let's go back to the core values, make sure everybody has a core value, a good core value, and a good work ethic. Uh, Getting dirty is not a bad thing. And you don't need to take the easy way out. And if I look at the evolution of agriculture, if you look back, say, let's go back to the 30s and 40s when the smaller operations, their children were their workforce. So they all have big families, right?
Yes.
And then things got more mechanized and more efficient. And all of a sudden, instead of taking 10 people to run that operation, it took 3 or 4. So they had all these kids that left agriculture and went to town. And the first thing they found out was it's a whole lot easier to make a living in town than it was back on the farm. So we have, a generation, possibly two in there that I believe probably encouraged those kids to leave. For one thing, there was too many of them. The farms couldn't support the whole family, so they had to leave. But I think we had, a mindset in there that probably went quite a ways that these kids needed to get away to be able to make a good living. So let's fast forward to today. It's somebody that wants to work. I mean, it's the employees market right now. We need employees and we can't find them. It's hard to find employees that want to go to work. And when I walk down through my plant, making my daily rounds, and I smile to myself at the people that have stayed with us and didn't go chase the big oil money and things like that. And that all comes with a price too. Yeah, they make more money, but they might be sleeping in a pickup in Minot, North Dakota with a guy they don't even know for a month.
Right.
We can offer them a better life here. But I think one of the mindsets that these young people, if I were to give a son or a daughter some advice right now going into the workforce is, you know, first of all, it's not a bad way to make a living with your hands. You don't have any other competition because not everybody's beating the door down to take that job. And you can live better if you don't look across the street at the Joneses and, well, I have to have a King Ranch pickup and I have to have a fancier house and things like that. You know, what's more important is making a living, taking care of your family, and having some money in the bank. Instead of spending the credit card limit every month. And you know, we see that in the people that stay here. They're that kind of people. They're not trying to be better than you or I. They don't look at me as being a different person as them because I try not to be.
Right.
I don't live in a big fancy mansion or anything like that. Could I afford it? No. Do I want to? No. I don't want to be that guy. I want to be a salt of the earth guy. And I think our young labor force needs to, you know, gear themselves towards that. Hey, let's go out and make a decent living and not try to gather it all in at once and get to the top of the food chain, in the first 5 years, because it's not going to happen anyway.
What advice would you give a 15-year-old young man or young woman that's wanting to be in agriculture, whether they're being raised on a farm or a ranch, or whether they're city kids? What advice would you give them, Tim?
I think the first direction I would point them to is learning a trade that they're happy with and they could be happy with for their life. And it doesn't matter what that trade is. It doesn't matter if you're a banker, if you're a judge, a lawyer, or a welder, or a cowboy, or a row crop guy. Find something that you want to do, be really, really good at it, and just stick with it. Just stick with it. Don't expect it all to come at once, because we didn't get it all at once either.
It takes a long time, doesn't it, to learn your trade?
I think these, some of these younger people are a little bit too impatient in that department. They see what I have. Well, I have more than they have because I've been at it for a few years. Maybe I can go to town and get my checkbook out and buy a new pickup and not have to borrow the money. And they see that, and they see that as a way to be somebody. And the way to be somebody is to be a man of integrity or a woman of integrity, do your job well, be amiable at it, and show up for work on time, and get promoted. Be patient, take those promotions when they're handed to you, because I guarantee you, if you work that way, they will be handed to you. And the guy that's staying at the back, yeah, maybe he spent a bunch of money and, he's more desperate for that job than a patient person would be. But we're getting to the point where that patient person is going to get the job.
I think you're absolutely right. And what I'm seeing in the workforce now is so many people are wanting to skip over the work part and go right to the top floor of the glass building. And they forget that, to me, and as I visit with my kids, it seems like to me that upper floor of that glass building, those jobs seem to be a lot more disposable than the guy who has learned a trade and is doing a great job in his trade.
Yes.
Would you agree?
Yes. And I think a well-rounded manager and, a person like myself or yourself that has been in a job for a long, long time, we started at the bottom and we learned how to do every job that's underneath of us very, very well. So it's very easy for me to manage those people and those segments of my manufacturing facility because I know what's going on down there. I've done it.
Yep.
Versus bringing somebody in here that may be a better marketing person than me, maybe a better accountant than me, maybe a better human resource person than me, but doesn't have that background of what those people are trying to accomplish that are underneath me.
Yep.
Hey, Tim told me something very important: surround yourself with good people and you'll never fail.
That's exactly right. Hey, Tim, unfortunately, we're completely out of time. Thank you very much for joining us on the Legacy of Agriculture, and I'm sure we're going to see you on the road.
Thanks for having me, Chris.
Thank you, Tim.
In it here now, what are you gonna do now? I'm gonna been on here now, who bid $500,000 bid.
We hope you've enjoyed today's edition of The Legacy of Agriculture with Chris Bear, sponsored by Pfeiffer's Auction, Realty, and Land Management. Call Pfeiffer's at 605-836-2277.